This is the story of the historic winter of 1880-1881, described through the words of Joseph Bobleter, the editor of the New Ulm Review. New Ulm is located in Brown County in south-central Minnesota. In 1880, its population was about 2,500 people. The town was located along the banks of the Minnesota River, which was its original supply line to the outside world. A bird's-eye view of New Ulm was drawn in 1870, which shows the Minnesota River in the lower left. As the river tended to flood fairly frequently, the main town site was located back from the river, on a slightly elevated platform. Minnesota Street was one of the main roads through town. The artist of the bird's-eye view also identified the prominent buildings in town, which included the courthouse, the school, Catholic Church, Turner Hall, Methodist Church, Lutheran Church, the Union Hotel, Eagle Mill, and the Globe Mill. The Winona and St. Peter Railroad reached New Ulm in 1872, bringing a more dependable transportation mode to town. The Winona and St. Peter Railroad was anchored in Winona, extending west to Rochester, Owatonna, and Mankato. The railroad crossed the Minnesota River at St. Peter, where it was built west to New Ulm. An 1886 plat map of Brown County and the city of New Ulm showed that the railroad crossed the Minnesota River again at Redstone, tracked into the city to the depot, and exited again to the west. The winter of 1880-1881 was one for the record books, pushing the people and the railroad to their breaking points. In the October 6th edition of the review, it seemed like a regular fall. One story discussed the joys of goose hunting, saying getting up early in the morning, traveling through a frigid north wind, and lying in a haystack for 4 hours was not their idea of fun. Joseph Bobleter, the editor, described his hunting experience as just loud, chattering teeth. A gymnastic exhibition and dance was held at Turner Hall, which lasted until 2 in the morning. The October 13th edition held some grim reminders of the perils of the early 1880s in Minnesota. Scarlet fever, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were deadly diseases to the residents, and to prevent their spread, public funerals were prohibited. October was prime harvest time, and wheat was brought to the various mills and elevators in New Ulm. The onslaught began from October 15th to 17th, with the first blizzard of the season. The review on the 20th said the storm began with a cold rain, then changed over to snow and strong wind, before ending on the morning of the 17th. By the end of the storm, all the ponds had frozen over, thick enough to support the weight of smaller boys. This cold was costly to the local farmers who still had potatoes in the ground. Frozen potatoes were basically worthless. Many young cattle also perished in the storm. Around the region, 10 to 12-foot snowdrifts were reported along the southern Minnesota Railroad. At Duluth, huge waves damaged the harbor and railroad property, washing away anything within their reach. On October 27th, the newspaper was filled with political material. One story announced a joint discussion at Turner Hall, where the debate would be carried on in German. Around the state, crews had finally broken through the snow blockade to reach Marshall. The Marshall paper said there were 15-foot-high snowdrifts on the main business streets in town. An immigrant family 6 miles from Springfield were found frozen to death. However, the cold had moderated, and the snow had started to melt. Stock losses in Redwood and western Brown counties were quite destructive. By November 3rd, politics still dominated the news. The Republican Party swept the entire ticket in Brown County and won the presidency of the United States. James Garfield was elected president, and Chester A. Arthur vice president. Crowds of Catholics in town and in the vicinity celebrated All Saints' Day, which also helped the local merchants. The news was not all good, as woodpiles in town were being attacked by thieves in the middle of the night. Near Madelia, a number of cattle were driven into Lake Hanska by the storm and drowned. Another snowstorm struck the area on Thursday, November 4th. The November 10th edition of the paper said the snow was light, but it did get fairly windy. It was also noted that the local waterfowl population had begun to migrate southward. Apples were a hot commodity, with hundreds of barrels being sold. Some of the apples came from Michigan. About a week later, another snowstorm struck the New Ulm area. The November 17th issue of the Review said it was another bad storm, but not as bad as the first October blizzard. Despite the lack of wood in some prairie towns, farmers had brought in a large amount of wood to sell in New Ulm. The New Ulm Turnverein celebrated its 24th anniversary on November 11th, featuring a gymnastic exhibition, concert, and dance. 2 local 9-year-old boys wowed the crowd with their violin skills. The people at Bird Island, Minnesota, ran out of wood and coal, so they helped themselves to the wood used by the steam engines on the railroad. The November 24th issue of the paper said that a series of dances would be held throughout the winter for entertainment. As the calendar flipped to December, temperatures turned frosty. Despite the cold, the newspaper said the local farmers continued to bring their produce to town. A Thanksgiving ball was held at Union Hall, and about 70 couples attended. A skating rink had been built, and many of the younger residents kept busy there. Around the state, the railroad finally brought Bird Island a supply of wood. However, a mad rush took place, and the people fought over the wood. Just outside of New Ulm, corn still stood in the fields, unable to be harvested due to the early snow. At Sleepy Eye, a correspondent saw one of the railroad's snowplows and thought it would make quick work of any winter snow. Another round of snow struck the area on December 4th. The December 8th edition of the Review called the snow beautiful, but said the accompanying wind made it decidedly disagreeable to being outside. Around the region, at Watertown, in modern-day South Dakota, the residents demolished a railroad bridge to use as fuel in their stoves. In Nicollet County, numerous fields of wheat were never harvested. At Beaver Falls, railroad service had become irregular. The December 15th Review actually noted a bit of a warm spell. Farmers took advantage of the weather and ventured into town to restock their needs. Ice harvesters began cutting large ice chunks out of the river to use during the coming summer. Thoughts also turned to Christmas, where New Ulm stores had filled their shelves and empty spaces with oysters, new goods, and Christmas trees. The weather did not agree with everyone. In Tracy, 380 passengers filled a train heading back east. However, these people were not out of danger yet. As the train neared Cortland, just east of New Ulm, a broken journal caused several cars to turn on their sides, and others to jump the track. Luckily, only the engineer was injured. A party of Cheyenne chiefs, heading to Washington to negotiate a treaty, were also on the train. One of the chiefs expressed his disgust at this new means of travel. A railroad worker walking on the Redstone Railroad Bridge was swept off by a passing locomotive with a plow. He fell about 20 feet into a snowdrift below, but managed to survive. That was not the case for one woman south of Iberia and a young man in Sibley County, who both lost their way and froze to death. Obtaining dependable fuel was definitely high on the priority list in the December 22nd issue of the Review. Many people in New Ulm began to switch to coal-burning stoves due to the shortage of wood. Numerous railroad cars filled with wood were seen passing through New Ulm, heading for the prairie towns further west. There was not a lot of time to move supplies, though, as another blizzard struck the area on December 26th. The December 29th issue of the Review carried the news about the blizzard, which shut down rail service again. It was not all bad news, though, as the residents of New Ulm managed to hold a Christmas ball and distribute presents to the children. Shipping grain and flour out of New Ulm was a challenge due to the lack of railroad cars for shipping. The latest blizzard shut down the railroads again, and it took 3 engines and a force of men 1 day to clear the track between Sleepy Eye and New Ulm. Some farmers were known to cheat on their measurements when selling wood, yet those same farmers didn't want to be cheated when they bought their groceries. Honesty could be in short supply too. Another snowstorm struck the region on December 29th. The January 5th paper noted that the last 2 storms put an end to all operations on the Winona and St. Peter Railroad west of St. Peter. The cold temperatures also caused issues, one specifically at Dr. Berry's office in New Ulm. One of the bottles in his office froze, pushing the cork up about 2 inches above the top of the bottle. Despite this action, the cork remained on top of the ice. The New Year's balls in New Ulm were well attended. Dancing continued well into the morning hours, and some of the exiting dancers howled loudly in the crisp, clear air as they departed. When a train finally reached New Ulm, a huge load of mail was delivered, taking the postmaster and his assistant about 3 hours to deliver it all. Cold weather was hard on the locomotives. If the water in the tanks froze, it could damage the engines. Horse teams were engaged to haul coal from Sleepy Eye to Springfield to keep the engines alive there. One resident of New Ulm went to visit one of the locations where men were digging the snow off the tracks. However, he got a little too close. When the engine and plow took a run at the drift, he was thrown over a fence and buried alive. Luckily, the men had seen him and rushed to dig him out. As he left, he was heard saying, "The blockade is open, boys. Goodbye." Fuel continued to be in short supply. The January 12th issue of the Review said that the farmers in southwest Brown County were burning hay to stay warm. The Winona and St. Peter Railroad had a particularly tough time keeping the track clear of snow between Oshawa and St. Peter. Another blizzard struck on January 12th and 13th. On January 19th, the newspaper said the storm featured whirling northwest winds. As the cold pushed in behind the blizzard, sundogs were visible in the sky. Once again, it took several days for the snow to be cleared from the track. The town of Canby did not have railroad service for 12 days after one of the blockades. Wood thieves stole a portion of the woodpile from a schoolhouse near Clear Lake. Another 3-day storm struck the area January 20th to 22nd. In its January 26th edition, the Review stated that the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Company was doing all it could to keep the railroad open, although the elements were against it. The Review also described a Masonic ball, which was held at Turner Hall. Like many other occasions, dancing continued into the early morning hours. Residents of Tracy shoveled snow along the railroad line for 4 days without compensation. One of the 15 dressed hogs being shipped to Watertown, Dakota Territory, was used to keep an engine alive. For a wide area west of Tracy, settlers were extremely short of fuel and food. 150 citizens of Sleepy Eye also joined the shoveling efforts along the railroad. These efforts were only temporary, as another snowstorm struck on January 30th and 31st. The February 2nd Review stated that the snowfall was heavy, once again taking a toll on the railroads. Around 90 citizens of New Ulm joined the shoveling mania as well. Although progress was being made, the wind caused continual drifting, which filled in the cleared spots right behind the crews. News arrived in New Ulm of 2 more brushes with death. One man lost his way, holed up in a haystack for the night, then made it home the next morning. A 15-year-old boy from Canby was badly frozen. The snow did not relent. Another snowstorm struck from February 4th to 6th. The newspaper from later that week said it was the worst snowstorm the oldest New Ulm settlers had ever seen. The town was buried in snow, with drifts along Minnesota Street between 8 and 10 feet deep. Although initially well supplied, some stores in New Ulm were running short of oil, coffee, and sugar. The New Ulm Band, which was heading for a performance in Sleepy Eye, got lost in the dark. After finding a house to stay at, they used one of their violins as kindling for the fire. As walking through the deep snow was difficult, New Ulm schools closed down for the week. Superintendent Sherburne Sanborn of the Winona and St. Peter Railroad and his crews of men encountered difficulties at both the Redstone and Cortland cuts. Redstone was just across the Minnesota River from New Ulm, and Cortland was the next station to the east. Wood did pile up in some areas. Mankato was said to be one vast woodyard. Since the railroad continued to have difficulty staying open, teams were hired to transport passengers between some points. At Springfield, one correspondent noted that it was impossible to see his neighbor's house. By mid-February, the cold had set in again. The review said the temperature had dipped to about 15 degrees below zero. Merchants along Minnesota Street had made progress in clearing the snow by hauling it off with teams. However, one business did not haul off their snow. Instead, they made a saloon inside a giant drift. Property tax payments were quite slow due to the poor conditions in the rural areas. Farmers continued to ask inflated prices for both wood and hay, to the annoyance of the residents of New Ulm. When a train finally broke through, it contained 13 days of mail, which included over 2,000 letters and 39 sacks of papers. Around the region, farmers grouped together to try to open rural roads. At Walnut Station, which would later become Walnut Grove, residents used the town flagpole, hitching posts, and stables as fuel. 2 New Ulm men, trying to get back home from Mankato, had to board their horses in Judson Township and walk the remaining 17 miles. The force of men employed by the railroad in clearing its track was up to about 500 men. Some farmers across western Minnesota resorted to burning their valuable stores of wheat as fuel. Another February snowstorm struck the region on February 22nd. The New Ulm Review of the 23rd noted that it started just like any other blizzard, but the snow was fairly short-lived. In New Ulm, a farmer coming to town to sell a load of hay based on weight became the butt of jokes. His load tipped over in the middle of Minnesota Street, revealing several large stones hidden inside. After weeks of hard labor, the large snowbanks along Minnesota Street had nearly all disappeared. Trains were running on a more regular schedule again, and thousands of pounds of goods were being delivered to the local merchants. However, at Canby, the residents stayed in bed most of the day just to keep warm. Drifting snow continued to cause problems for the railroads. Cuts that had been cleared of snow quickly filled back in again. 2 travelers through New Ulm told the story of how they had been trapped in a snowbound passenger train north of Albert Lea for 7 days and nights. They were kept alive by section men and neighboring farmers who brought them food. 700 men were employed by the Southern Minnesota Railroad, which claimed the only 2 points not blockaded along their route were 2 bridges over rivers. As the calendar flipped to March, there were faint signs of spring. The review mentioned that temperatures had warmed briefly, but then dropped well below zero again. Around the state, the St. Peter Tribune reported another death from the cold. This time a drunken man. In southern Renville County, 3 families had moved into one house, using the other buildings for fuel. The following issue of the review had few changes to note about the weather. The snow remained very deep. Despite the poor conditions of the roads, some farmers managed to bring their wheat into town to sell. At Lamberton, cattle continued to starve from the desperate conditions. The local newspaper even shut down, due to the stress of finding fuel and the deep snow. At Walnut Grove, residents were burning corn as fuel. Blockages continued between Sleepy Eye and New Ulm, causing continual headaches for the railroad. Schools shut down in Sleepy Eye when they ran out of fuel to keep their buildings warm. At Fort Ridgely, neighbors banded together to keep each other supplied with wood and food. To keep each other from going crazy, people held dances, played cards, read books, and drank beer. March could still bring dangerous weather. 2 additional snowstorms occurred, one on March 11th and 12th, and the other from March 14th to 15th. The newspaper from the 16th said the weather had been beautiful, but these storms piled up the snow into huge drifts again. The Winona paper carried a story about a man who walked along the railroad tracks 140 miles, from Huron toward Winona, before he found a connecting train to carry him the rest of the way. Horse teams could not make it through to New Ulm from Cortland. Walking along the railroad tracks was not always a good idea. A young woman walking along the track near Kasota was killed by an express train that did not see her. A windstorm on March 19th slammed the railroads again. In its March 23rd issue, the review said the worst problems were between New Ulm and Sleepy Eye. Around the region, the first train finally pushed through to Bird Island on March 14th, which was the first one since January 25th. The Sioux City Railroad finally opened their line to St. James on March 17th. The St. James newspaper said that claims from that area of farmers burning their farm implements as fuel were untrue. The parent company of the Winona and St. Peter Railroad, the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, claimed the winter blockades had cost them around $300,000. A passenger train ran into a handcar near Mankato, killing a railroad worker who was paralyzed with fear. In its final issue of March 1881, the review had a few positive notes. First, enough snow had finally melted that wagons were being used instead of sleighs. Wild geese had also been seen flying over town, which was a sure sign of spring. Native Americans warned the settlers that a huge flood would be coming along the Minnesota River. The railroad had yet to break through the blockade to Marshall, but men were actively working to dig out the huge drifts. One young lady in Marshall showed the strength of Minnesotans by walking on snowshoes 15 miles one way just to visit friends. Near Fulda, residents built snowboats with sails and skis. One boat traveled 32 miles in 3 hours. Another story emerged about a group of travelers who were denied a place to stay near New Ulm. Instead of camping outdoors in the elements, they and their horses spent the night in a schoolhouse. Another fatality occurred in the railroad cut near Mankato when a man lost his footing and fell under a passing train. On March 30th and 31st, another blizzard struck the area west of New Ulm. Although the review contained no information about this storm, the Marshall paper did mention it. On April 6th, the review noted the Minnesota River was still covered in ice, 36 inches thick. At Sleepy Eye, one farmer won a contract to supply 1,500 pounds of meat weekly to the snow shovelers on the Winona and St. Peter Railroad. When the kerosene ran out in Marshall, one resident and his mule team drove to Mankato for 4 barrels. When he arrived home, the appreciative citizens and the band had a procession through town. Due to melting and refreezing, the deep snow had become so hard in spots that it had to be broken up with picks. During one of the storms, a settler near Lake Benton heard his roof crack. The man dressed up and shoveled continuously through the night to prevent his roof from caving in. Springfield residents dreamt of the day when the whistle of the locomotive would be heard once again. However, winter had still not given up. Another snowstorm hit the area on April 10th and 11th. The newspaper from the 13th said the fresh snow reminded people that it was still winter. The thawing process made the country roads nearly impassable. The Waseca Herald wrote that numerous loads of freight were backed up in that town, waiting for the blockade to be lifted. Records kept at Fort Snelling confirmed that this was a record year for snowfall. A hog was found under a snowdrift in Fairmont, having survived for 45 days. Just south of Worthington, in northern Iowa, one drift was 8 miles long and 15 feet deep. Huge chunks of snow were removed like large blocks of ice. Redwood Falls was finally freed of the blockade on April 8th. The Lamberton Commercial stated that a party of men, desperate for fuel, carried off pieces of the railroad bridge over Pell Creek. Despite the problems clearing snow from the western Minnesota railroads, towns were full of strangers waiting for the roads to be cleared. On April 20th, the first rain of the spring season fell. The ice went out on the Minnesota River at New Ulm on April 17th. A grand Easter ball was also held in New Ulm on April 17th, with Easter eggs for all. The blockade was cleared to Walnut Grove on Monday the 18th. In its final issue of April, the review reported that the expected Great Flood was now raging. To prevent such a fuel crisis again, one company said it would start erecting and stocking coal bins at numerous points along the Winona and St. Peter Railroad. In freeing Marshall from its blockade, one engine, while plunging into a snowdrift, also hit a lake of water below. A huge wave of water rained down on the workers and put out the fire in the locomotive. That was the winter of 1880-1881. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.